The moment I heard the knock, I knew something was off. It wasn't the friendly tap of a neighbor. It was sharp, angry, relentless. And when I opened the door, there she was, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, glaring at me like I'd just committed a crime. Her voice shook with rage as she pointed at my driveway. My car, parked in my own space, was suddenly a violation. Within seconds, she was shouting about fines, threatening letters, even legal action. I stood there, stunned, as she snapped photos of my house like she was gathering evidence for a trial that hadn't even begun. Then came the warning that made my stomach drop. If you don't comply, we'll make you wish you had. That was the moment everything changed. What started as a petty complaint spiraled into something much darker. Late-night harassment, false reports, and neighbors I'd known for years suddenly turning cold. I thought I was safe inside my own home, but I was wrong. What do you do when the place that's supposed to be your sanctuary becomes a battlefield? When the people living just feet away turn into enemies?
For years, the cul-de-sac at the end of Willow Bend Drive felt like the kind of place people dreamed about on long commutes. Neatly trimmed lawns, kids racing scooters along the sidewalks, porch lights glowing warm in the evenings. This was the kind of neighborhood that seemed to hum with safety and routine. And for Daniel, it had been a promise finally kept. He'd bought the beige two-story house at the very end of the street 5 years ago after a decade of scrimping and saving in a cramped apartment. Back then, he'd walked through the empty rooms with the echo of his footsteps bouncing off bare walls, barely able to believe this place was his. A place where his daughter could grow up riding bikes on quiet streets. A place where no one slammed doors or fought in hallways. A place that finally felt like home. Daniel threw himself into making it beautiful. Weekends were spent sanding down old porch railings, planting bursts of marigolds along the walkway, and repainting shutters a calm shade of slate blue. He liked how it stood out just enough to be different without screaming for attention. When neighbors strolled past, they'd smile and wave, sometimes pausing to compliment the flower beds. Those little moments meant more to him than they probably realized. For a man who'd always kept to himself, this felt like belonging. The community had rhythms, almost like an unspoken script everyone followed. Mornings were quiet except for sprinklers ticking across front lawns. Evenings smelled faintly of barbecue and fresh-cut grass. Sundays were slow, with dogs wandering lazily on long leashes and kids sprawled in driveways with chalk-stained hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, predictable, safe. Daniel liked it that way. He paid his HOA dues on time, read their monthly newsletters, and tried to follow the rules even when they seemed fussy or overly strict. No overnight street parking, no trash cans visible from the road, lawn kept below 3 inches. The list was long and the language was oddly formal, but Daniel didn't mind. He understood the point. Keep the neighborhood clean, keep property values up, keep everyone happy. And honestly, for years it worked. Everyone got along, or at least pretended to. The HOA board was small and mostly invisible, a handful of longtime residents who met once a month in the community clubhouse. They sent out neatly typed emails about landscaping contracts and community garage sales, and for the most part, they stayed out of sight. Occasionally, someone would get a gentle warning about a fence in need of repainting or a lawn that looked a little wild, but it was always polite, always wrapped in a smiley face tone. Back then, Daniel never imagined they could be anything but harmless. His daughter, Emma, was 8 now, bright, fearless, forever darting barefoot between sprinklers and leaving trails of giggles down the street. She knew every dog's name on the block and treated every neighbor like extended family. People adored her. Even the older residents, who rarely smiled, would soften when she bounded past on her scooter, hair streaming behind her like a banner. Those were the golden days, when Daniel felt like he'd finally cracked the code to life. Quiet work days, peaceful nights, a safe neighborhood where nothing bad ever really happened. But There were little things, subtle things, moments that, looking back, seemed like the first faint cracks in the picture-perfect surface. Like the way Mrs. Langley from 2 doors down would pause just a beat too long when looking at Daniel's yard, her gaze flicking from his car to the slate-blue shutters with a faint pinch in her expression, gone before he could name it. Or how the HOA newsletters started including more bolded reminders about community standards and visual uniformity, phrases Daniel skimmed past without thinking much about them. He figured it was just the board doing its job. And then there was the new neighbor, Janice, who moved into the brick house across the cul-de-sac. She introduced herself with a wide, practiced smile and a firm handshake, the kind of introduction that felt like an announcement. She was quick to ask questions about the neighborhood, about the HOA rules, about who enforced things when people stepped out of line. At the time, Daniel just laughed it off. Everyone has quirks, he told himself. She probably just liked structure. He didn't know yet that Janice had joined the HOA board almost immediately. He didn't know how quickly that smile could turn sharp. For now, life was still calm, still safe. Emma was excited about the new treehouse they were planning to build together in the backyard. Daniel had just bought the lumber and spent an entire Saturday sketching out designs with her on the kitchen table, her crayon lines crisscrossing his careful measurements. He pictured summers spent up there with her, reading books, sipping lemonade, spying on squirrels, a tiny hideaway where nothing and no one could bother them. It never crossed his mind that something as simple as a treehouse could light a fuse. The next week, he noticed a car parked across the street with someone inside, just sitting there, engine off, watching. It struck him as odd, but the moment he stepped onto his porch, the car started and rolled away. He told himself it was nothing, just someone lost or waiting for a friend. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. There were other things too, small but unsettling. A letter from the HOA reminding residents to submit all exterior modifications for approval. A knock on the door one evening when he was working late. No one there when he answered, just a folded flyer tucked into the crack, warning about unauthorized structures affecting neighborhood aesthetics. It wasn't addressed to anyone, and there was no signature, just the HOA logo printed at the top. Daniel set it aside without thinking. Rules are rules, but surely they weren't about him. He hadn't even built anything yet. Besides, this was his home, his yard, his daughter's childhood. He had no idea the storm gathering just beyond the horizon, the letters, the complaints, the shouting matches that would shatter the calm like glass. No idea that neighbors he'd waved to for years would suddenly avoid eye contact, or the HOA board would come knocking, not with friendly reminders, but with threats. For now, the shutters were still slate blue, the marigolds still blooming. Emma's laughter still rang down the cul-de-sac. The world still seemed steady. But the quiet harmony of Willow Bend Drive was already cracking. And Daniel was about to find out what happens when the people meant to protect your neighborhood decide they want control of it instead.
The first letter seemed harmless enough. It arrived in a crisp white envelope with the HOA's logo embossed at the top. Official, cold, and faintly condescending. Daniel opened it at the kitchen counter while Emma colored at the table. He expected another reminder about lawn care or trash bin placement. Instead, it read like a warning. Notice of violation. Unapproved construction materials present on property. He frowned. The letter claimed he had stored unsightly lumber and construction items visible from the street, which negatively impacted community visual standards. It demanded removal within 72 hours or face a $150 fine. He stared at the page. The unsightly lumber was the wood stacked neatly along the side of his garage. The wood for Emma's treehouse. It wasn't messy. It wasn't blocking anyone's view. It was his property. He crumpled the letter and tossed it aside, thinking there must have been a mistake. He'd just explain at the next HOA meeting. Surely they'd understand. They didn't. At the meeting, Daniel was met with blank stares from the board and one too wide smile from Janice, who now sat squarely at the center of the table, a little name placard in front of her. She listened as he explained, nodding slowly, like a teacher humoring a misbehaving student. Then she spoke. "You're required to get approval before bringing construction materials on site. It keeps things consistent." "Consistent?" Daniel echoed. "It's wood for a small treehouse. It's temporary." Janice's smile didn't move. "Rules are rules. If we make exceptions, everything unravels." Her tone made it sound less like a policy and more like a threat. They upheld the violation. No discussion, no compromise. If the materials weren't gone by Friday, the fine would double. Daniel left that meeting with a stack of papers and a knot of anger sitting in his chest. He moved the wood into his garage to avoid more trouble, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, another letter appeared. This time, it claimed his car was parked too close to the sidewalk, obstructing pedestrian flow. It wasn't. He measured. It sat well within the lines of his driveway, exactly where it had always been. But the HOA had included a grainy photo taken from across the street, a photo snapped at night from a low angle, as if someone had creeped onto his lawn to take it. The fine was $200. He appealed again. They denied it. This time they didn't even let him speak at the meeting. He sat in a plastic chair as they voted in front of him, talking about him like he wasn't even there. Janice's voice carried above the rest, smooth and decisive. "We have to be firm. If one person breaks the rules, everyone thinks they can." Break the rules? For parking in his own driveway? It became a pattern. A letter for leaving his trash bin out 15 minutes past pickup time. A fine because his marigolds by his walkway weren't on the approved plant list. A notice saying his mailbox was faded and needed to be repainted immediately. Individually, they were small, petty, but they came like clockwork, each one sharper than the last. And always signed at the bottom, Janice M., HOA Compliance Chair. Soon, neighbors stopped waving. They crossed the street when they saw him coming, eyes sliding away. Word spread, whispered and warped, that Daniel was combative, that he didn't respect the community, that he was on the board's radar. Radar, like he was being hunted. Emma started noticing too. "Why don't they like us anymore?" she asked one night as he tucked her in. Her voice was small, puzzled. "Did we do something bad?" Daniel forced a smile he didn't feel. "Of course not. Some people just like making rules." But when she fell asleep, he sat in the dark hallway outside her room, fists clenched. This was supposed to be her safe place, their safe place, and someone was trying to take it from them. Then came the letter that made his hands shake. Final notice. Continued non-compliance may result in legal action, property liens, or foreclosure proceedings as outlined in the HOA charter. Foreclosure. Over fines that weren't even real. Over marigolds, over lumber, over a driveway. It felt like something cracked inside him. The board wasn't just enforcing rules, they were trying to break him, crush him until he either submitted or left. He decided for the first time that he wasn't going to do either. Daniel started documenting everything. He photographed his driveway, his mailbox, the perfectly clipped edges of his lawn. He saved every letter, every time-stamped email. He even set up a small security camera on his porch, not to protect his house, but to prove he wasn't doing anything wrong. And that's when things got worse. Late at night, motion alerts pinged his phone. Shadows moved at the edge of his yard, figures slipping past, quick and silent. He reviewed the footage and caught flashes of phones glowing in the dark, aimed at his house. Someone was watching. Someone was building a case. One morning, he woke to find bright orange spray paint slashed across his garbage can. Rule breaker. The HOA denied knowing anything about it. Still, he tried to live normally, tried to smile at the neighbors, to keep Emma shielded from the tension tightening around their home like a fist. But the weight never left his chest. Every car that slowed in front of his house made his stomach twist. Every creak outside at night sent him bolting upright in bed. Then, without warning, a certified letter landed on his doorstep. This one was different, longer, harsher. Due to repeated and willful violations, you are hereby ordered to attend a mandatory disciplinary hearing before the board. Failure to comply will result in immediate escalation to legal counsel. A hearing, like a trial, like he was a criminal. The date was in bold, 3 days away. Daniel folded the letter slowly, like if he moved too fast, it might explode. His hands were trembling. That night, he stood at his upstairs window, watching the cul-de-sac below. Everything looked the same, the glowing porch lights, the still sidewalks, the faint hum of crickets. But it felt different now. The air seemed heavier, quieter. Like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see if he would break. He didn't know what the board had planned. He didn't know what Janice would say, or how far they were willing to go. But one thing was clear. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was war. The night before the hearing, Daniel didn't sleep. He lay on the couch with the glow of the porch light bleeding through the blinds, watching the shadows of tree branches scrape across the walls. His laptop was open on the coffee table, surrounded by stacks of letters, printed emails, photos, and HOA bylaws highlighted like a map to buried treasure. Except there was nothing golden about it, only rot. Every line he read made his stomach twist tighter. Clause 14b, all exterior modifications must receive prior written approval. Clause 22F, unpaid fines may be enforced via lien or foreclosure. Clause 3C, failure to comply may result in suspension of community privileges at the board's discretion. Discretion. That word echoed in his head like a gunshot. It meant power, the kind that didn't need to explain itself, the kind that could erase everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, just because they decided to. Emma padded into the room around midnight, her small feet soft on the carpet. "Daddy, why are you still up?" She forced a smile. "Just getting ready for tomorrow." She nodded sleepily and curled up next to him on the couch. Within minutes, she was out, her head resting on his arm. Daniel stared at her for a long time, her steady breathing the only calm thing in the world. And he made himself a promise. They could find him. They could smear him. They could try to crush him. But they were not taking her home. The hearing was scheduled for 6 p.m. sharp in the community clubhouse. Daniel arrived at 5:59 with a manila folder under one arm and a camera slung over his shoulder. The folder held every scrap of evidence he'd collected: dated photographs, time-stamped footage, screenshots of bylaws, emails with contradictory instructions. The camera was rolling before he even stepped inside. He wanted a record of everything. The clubhouse smelled like disinfectant and artificial lemon. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A long folding table stretched across the room like a barricade. 5 board members sat behind it, expressionless. At the center, as he expected, was Janice. She wore a navy blazer and a smile that never touched her eyes. "Mr. Hale," she said as he entered, her tone the verbal equivalent of a forced handshake. "Please, have a seat." Daniel pulled a chair to the middle of the room. He set his folder on the table, clicked his pen once, and waited. Janice cleared her throat and began reading from a prepared statement. Over the past several months, this board has documented repeated violations committed by Mr. Hale, including unapproved construction materials, improper vehicle placement, prohibited flora, failure to maintain exterior fixtures, and general non-compliance with the community's agreed-upon standards. Her voice droned on, but her words slammed against Daniel's skull like stones. Cumulative fines now total $3,450. Per Section 22F, we are within our rights to initiate a lien on your property if non-compliance persists. Daniel lifted his gaze slowly. "You want to take my house?" Janice sharpened her smile. "We want you to follow the rules." The board murmured their agreement like a hive of bees. Daniel took a breath, steadying the rush of heat in his chest. Then he opened his folder and began laying out papers like cards in a magician's trick, one after another, crisp and undeniable. "Here's my car." He slid a photo across the table. "Dated and measured, no obstruction." A pause. "Here are the marigolds you fined me for." Another photo. According to the landscaping appendix, he flipped a page. Section 8C, they're on the approved list. Another pause. "Here's my mailbox." He tossed down a printout of an email from the HOA's maintenance contractor. "Mailboxes were repainted 2 years ago and are in acceptable condition." That's your own vendor saying that. Silence. Janice's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board, yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaw stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage," he added, gesturing to his camera. "Video footage of people trespassing on my property at night to take photos. That's criminal harassment." One of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat and looked at Janice. She didn't flinch, but the shine of confidence in her eyes had dulled. Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it thrummed with something electric. "And here," he said, tapping the final sheet, "are screenshots of your bylaws stating all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board. Yet none of these so-called violations show any record of a vote, not one." The room went still. "I've also got video footage."
When the gavel struck the wooden block, the sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, like the closing of a vault. For a moment, silence lingered, almost hesitant, as if even sound itself was trying to process what had just happened. The HOA had been found guilty. Guilty of harassment, of fraudulent fines, of overstepping the very bylaws they claimed to protect. They were ordered to pay damages, not just to him, but to several other neighbors who had quietly joined the class action suit he had spearheaded. Years of intimidation collapsed in a single afternoon. And as he sat there, hands trembling not for fear, but with adrenaline and relief, he could barely remember how it felt to wake up without a knot of dread in his stomach. The board members who had glared at him for months now looked pale, hollow, and deflated, as though the air had finally been let out of their puffed-up authority. Outside the courthouse, the sky seemed brighter than it had in months. The reporters who had caught wind of the trial swarmed around him, microphones like curious metal flowers. He didn't give them much. just enough to set the record straight. "I wasn't trying to break rules," he said, voice steady despite the storm still crashing in his chest. "I was trying to live." That quote would end up everywhere. On the evening news, on social media clips, even on local opinion columns about HOA abuse. For the first time in years, the narrative wasn't controlled by threatening letters slipped under doors or whispered gossip at board meetings. It belonged to him. When he finally drove back into the neighborhood, something strange happened. Curtains didn't twitch closed as he passed. Doors opened instead of shutting. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years walked out to their mailboxes just as he parked, and for once, they didn't look away. Some clapped, others just nodded with subtle, grateful smiles, as if silently thanking him for doing what they'd all been too afraid to attempt. He realized then that he hadn't just freed himself, he had cracked the spell of fear the HOA had cast over everyone. The HOA board resigned in waves over the next few weeks. First, the treasurer, who had signed off on the bogus fines. Then the secretary, who admitted in an email leak that she couldn't stomach the witch hunts anymore. The president held on the longest, issuing furious newsletters that dripped with condescension and denial, until the membership voted her out in a special recall meeting. He didn't even attend that meeting. He just watched from his porch as people streamed past, heads high for the first time in years. The HOA wasn't dissolved entirely. Legally, it couldn't be. But it was reborn under new leadership, one that treated bylaws as guidelines instead of weapons. As weeks rolled into months, the tangible evidence of tyranny began to fade. The cameras aimed at his driveway came down. The noise complaints about children playing stopped. The once hostile monthly meetings turned into casual neighborhood gatherings with barbecues and potlucks, where people actually laughed instead of whispering accusations. His own property, once the alleged eyesore, became the unofficial symbol of resilience. People asked him for advice on home projects, waved when they passed, even dropped off cookies at Christmas. It was almost unsettling at first, this sudden acceptance, but slowly it stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like community.
Financially, the victory changed more than just him. The damages the HOA paid were distributed among the plaintiffs, which meant several of his neighbors could finally afford long-delayed repairs or pay off legal bills they had quietly racked up defending themselves. It sparked something unexpected, a wave of homeowners digging up old violation letters and challenging them, not out of spite, but out of a newfound belief that they didn't have to accept unfair treatment just because it came on HOA letterhead. The new board quickly realized that transparency was their only path forward, and they published all financial records, meeting minutes, and rule changes online for anyone to see. That simple act alone transformed the entire dynamic of the neighborhood, from secrecy and suspicion to reluctant trust. Emotionally, though, the aftermath was more complicated. Winning hadn't erased the years of stress. It hadn't undone the nights he'd spent pacing in the dark, wondering if he'd lose his home. The smell of certain colognes still made his chest tighten, the same brand the old HOA president had worn when she cornered him at the mailbox with her clipped threats. But therapy helped, and so did the steady, mundane rhythm of peace returning. He rebuilt his garden, not because he had to prove anything anymore, but because he wanted beauty again. He hosted his first neighborhood cookout in years, and when more than 30 people showed up with folding chairs and coolers, he felt something shift inside him. The fear that had once shadowed every interaction was gone. The impact rippled beyond their street. Local news outlets ran follow-up stories for months, using his case as an example in broader discussions about HOA reform. State lawmakers even reached out to interview him about drafting legislation that would limit the disciplinary powers of HOAs, requiring external oversight for fines above a certain threshold. He never imagined that his personal nightmare could spark policy change, but when he testified before a state committee about the psychological toll of unchecked HOA authority, he saw a few legislators quietly wiping their eyes. That day he drove home without turning the radio on, just letting the silence soak in, realizing he had taken something ugly and turned it into a blueprint for others. Even so, he never sought revenge on the people who had tried to crush him. It would have been easy to gloat, to savor their humiliation, but he didn't. When the former president put her house up for sale, he didn't celebrate. He just watched the for sale sign go up and felt nothing. That, he realized, was victory, not needing them to lose for him to win. What mattered was that he had stood his ground without becoming like them. In the years that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways that would have once been unthinkable. The new board created community projects, shared gardens, small park spaces, even a tool-sharing shed so no one had to fight over grass length again. Property values actually rose, not because of oppressive uniformity, but because people wanted to live there. Real estate listings started using words like friendly and close-knit instead of just well-regulated or highly maintained. The very culture of fear the old board had clung to as a source of control became a cautionary tale to new residents. Sometimes he would catch himself standing on his porch, coffee in hand, watching kids ride bikes where once even laughter had drawn angry letters, and he'd marvel at how different it all felt. How light. He still kept the thick binder of every violation notice, fine, and threatening letter they had ever sent him, not as a trophy, more like a scar, a reminder of what he survived and what he would never let happen again. Occasionally, when someone new moved in and whispered nervously about a warning letter they received, he would invite them in, make them tea, and quietly tell them the whole story. By the time they left, they always stood a little taller. In the end, the real victory wasn't the money or even the legal win. It was the way fear had been replaced by connection. It was knowing that the place he called home was finally worthy of the word, that he had turned the worst experience of his life into something bigger, a message to anyone crushed under petty authority that resistance is possible, that bullies can be beaten. And whenever he thought about the years he spent wondering if he was crazy for fighting back, he only had to look at the street around him now, alive and laughing, to know the answer. He hadn't just defended his home, he had reclaimed it. And on quiet nights, when the porch light hums softly and the crickets sing in the grass he grows however long he damn well pleases, he lets himself smile, because he knows that if they ever try to take it from him again, he won't be fighting alone.